Hey guys, tonight we dive deep into the heavy drapes, candlelit shadows, and stifling bedchambers of Tudor England. You're standing in the royal residence of Whitehall Palace, right at the edge of a scene both historic and haunting. The year is 1547, and Henry VIII, once the charismatic golden boy of Europe, now a bloated, ulcerated shadow of a man, is dying. He lies motionless, surrounded by anxious physicians, scheming nobles, and the thick stench of decay. You can almost feel the weight of the air pressing and the thick smell of sweat infection and frankincense swirling like a noxious perfume. His enormous frame barely fits in the carved oak bed. His legs are bandaged, seeping foul-smelling fluids. His breathing is labored wet rattling, and yet no one dares to speak the obvious. The king is dying, but no one will say it out loud. This isn't just the end of a monarch, it's the death of an era, and you're standing right in the middle of it. From his 6 ill-fated marriages to his impulsive religious reforms, Henry VIII has reshaped England like a petulant toddler reshapes a birthday cake with sticky fingers and no regard for the mess. And now the man who broke from Rome and beheaded 2 of his wives can't even lift his head from the pillow. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Invite viewers to post their location and local time. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shift slightly, tiptoeing closer. His courtiers linger at the edge of the room, faces pale, hands folded awkwardly. You overhear a whispered conversation about when or if they should summon the archbishop. Another mentions something about the will. You catch the tail end of the phrase, "He hasn't signed it." Your pulse slows, but your thoughts race. The King of England may die without a legally valid will. That could get awkward. You glance down at the foot of the bed. There lies a small embroidered stool normally reserved for a man with one of the strangest royal duties in history. The groom of the stool. A title both prestigious and ridiculous. He was the one who helped Henry use the royal commode. He's not in the room now. Maybe he's resigned. Maybe he's weeping into a towel somewhere. Either way, no one wants to be near Henry's body right now, even if it's technically still alive. There's a creak as someone opens a window, just a crack, a desperate bid for fresh air. The scent of winter outside mingles with the thick, meat-sweet odor of festering ulcers. Someone coughs softly into a handkerchief. You realize you're holding your breath. Henry lets out a guttural noise. One physician jumps. Another nervously checks his pulse, and then pretends to write something on a scroll. The others murmur among themselves, arguing whether they should bleed him again or try more holy relics. Maybe both. After all, when in doubt, Tudor medicine usually involved puncturing veins and invoking divine mercy. If the bloodletting didn't work, perhaps St. Thomas's fingerbone would. The scholars of today still debate what exactly killed Henry. Was it kidney failure? Complications from his infected leg ulcers? Type 2 diabetes, syphilis? Or perhaps just the weight of being Henry VIII? The jury's out on that one, and let's be honest, he didn't make it easy for future medical sleuths. His autopsy was, well, non-existent. No one dared cut him open, and those who saw what happened next didn't want to talk about it. You notice that time in the chamber seems to move slowly, like honey left out in the cold. Nothing happens for long stretches. Then someone twitches. A priest mutters a Latin phrase. A candle flickers as a draft sneaks in from the corridor. Everything is waiting. Everyone is hoping someone else will make the first move. As the hours crawl by, you begin to understand this isn't just fear of death. This is fear of being blamed. In Tudor court politics, being the first to say, "The king is dead," is a great way to lose your head. Literally. So they all sit, wait, breathe shallowly. One noble finally bends close to the king's bloated face, perhaps hoping for a sign. Henry gurgles faintly. His eyelids twitch. A trace of movement from a dying man, or perhaps just gas. You back away slightly just in case. Midnight passes. Another hour ticks on the ornate clock by the fireplace. The courtiers shift their weight from foot to foot. It's almost theatrical, except no one dares to call cut. You press your back to the wall still and quiet. Welcome to the Royal Death Watch, where no one wants to be here and no one dares to leave. You're still in that stifling room, and it's hard to tell whether time is moving at all. You stare at the massive shape beneath the velvet covers. Henry's bulk is monstrous, misshapen by years of excess and infection. There's something both tragic and grotesque about him now, like a wax sculpture melting under too many candles. Suddenly a groan bubbles from his throat. One of the physicians jumps as though struck. Another pretends to scribble notes, though the ink bottle has long run dry. Everyone hears the wet sound of his chest rattling a hollow, gurgling struggle to breathe. But still no one moves. Because in this court, the greatest crime isn't treason. It's misreading the room. And then it begins. From beneath the sheets, a faint sound of squelch. A warm, sickly odor rolls out like fog. The courtiers' faces tense. Some turn away. One of the younger stewards, quietly dry, heaves into the sleeve of his coat. Henry's body is leaking. It's subtle at first. A slow seepage from his ulcerated legs. But it worsens by the hour. You try not to look at the foot of the bed, but your eyes betray you. One of the linen sheets is darker than the others. Damp, stained, rotting from the inside out. And it's not even morning yet. In the far corner of the room, someone mutters a half-hearted prayer. Another suggests more myrrh, or maybe lavender. One bold soul whispers something about vinegar. Someone else wonders aloud whether the doctors should make another incision. This prompts a fierce whisper fight among the royal physicians, who are already arguing whether this is a matter of the humours being out of balance or the soul trying to escape a poisoned body. You might want to take a moment to breathe through your mouth now. By this point, Henry is effectively unconscious, his eyes half-lidded, his breath wheezing through cracked lips. And yet the men around him continue to pretend he might recover. Why? Because officially the king cannot die without royal witnesses, proper ceremony, and a will. And that will, still, isn't signed. And so, like a court full of Shakespearean extras trapped in an awkward improvisation, they wait. They argue about relics, quote scripture, and take turns pretending that pus and perfume are signs of vitality. Meanwhile, Henry's body continues to break down. One leg, ulcerated for years, has ruptured. The wound is now open to the bone. You hear someone mutter that the king's flesh is turning sweet. Not in the poetic sense, more like overripe meat. Insects have been spotted circling the chamber. A page boy swats at something near the drapes and tries to hide his gag reflex. Here's a curious historical aside for you. Some contemporary sources mentioned that Henry had to be wheeled around in a special mechanical chair near the end of his life. He couldn't walk, couldn't dress himself, and reportedly lashed out at those who helped him. The iron will that once defied popes and toppled monasteries now just kicks the closest servant in a fit of frustration. A monarch undone by his own mobility scooter. You wonder if he's dreaming right now, perhaps, of past glories, jousting tournaments, or his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, whom he later discarded like a stained tablecloth. If ghosts linger in the mind, Henry's are already gathering. Anne Boleyn's headless shadow might be lurking just outside the room. Someone at the window coughs deliberately. Perhaps he says delicately we should send for the Archbishop now. The room falls silent. This is the moment. Everyone looks at everyone else, silently urging someone else to agree. At last, a higher-ranking noble nods. A page is dispatched with haste. You exhale. Finally, something resembling a decision. Then a strange thing happens. A small tremor moves through Henry's massive body. Not breath, not will, just air. His bowels release. The stench is immediate and profound. A murmur runs through the room. One man leaves without a word. Another vomits quietly into a potted plant. The king has not yet been declared dead, but to your senses it's abundantly clear he's already gone. You lean against the wall and consider how absurd all of this is. The most powerful man in England, conqueror of lands and destroyer of monasteries, leaking into his bedsheets while a room full of terrified aristocrats pretends nothing is happening. History books often brush past these details. They skip to the date of death, the tomb, the politics. But this is the reality of royal death. Messy, slow, pathetic. You don't die a king, you die a sack of meat like anyone else. And that brings us to a curious moment of reflection, doesn't it? Whisper one in the comments below if this tale charms your heart, or two if it sends shivers down your spine. Now the Archbishop still hasn't arrived. The night drags on. Somewhere downstairs a fire crackles. Upstairs the King of England is decomposing, and still no one dares to say it. You're still in that stifling room, and it's hard to tell whether time is moving at all. You stare at the massive shape beneath the velvet covers. Henry's bulk is monstrous, misshapen by years of excess and infection. There's something both tragic and grotesque about him now, like a wax sculpture melting under too many candles. Suddenly a groan bubbles from his throat. One of the physicians jumps as though struck. Another pretends to scribble notes, though the ink bottle has long run dry. Everyone hears the wet sound of his chest rattling a hollow, gurgling struggle to breathe. But still no one moves. Because in this court, the greatest crime isn't treason. It's misreading the room. And then it begins. From beneath the sheets, a faint sound of squelch. A warm, sickly odor rolls out like fog. The courtiers' faces tense. Some turn away. One of the younger stewards, quietly dry, heaves into the sleeve of his coat. Henry's body is leaking. It's subtle at first, a slow seepage from his ulcerated legs, but it worsens by the hour. You try not to look at the foot of the bed, but your eyes betray you. One of the linen sheets is darker than the others. Damp, stained, rotting from the inside out. And it's not even morning yet. In the far corner of the room, someone mutters a half-hearted prayer. Another suggests more myrrh, or maybe lavender. One bold soul whispers something about vinegar. Someone else wonders aloud whether the doctors should make another incision. This prompts a fierce whisper fight among the royal physicians, who are already arguing whether this is a matter of the humours being out of balance or the soul trying to escape a poisoned body. You might want to take a moment to breathe through your mouth now. By this point, Henry is effectively unconscious, his eyes half-lidded, his breath wheezing through cracked lips. And yet the men around him continue to pretend he might recover. Why? Because officially the king cannot die without royal witnesses, proper ceremony and a will, and that will still isn't signed. And so, like a court full of Shakespearean extras trapped in an awkward improvisation, they wait. They argue about relics, quote, scripture, and take turns pretending that pus and perfume are signs of vitality. Meanwhile, Henry's body continues to break down. One leg, ulcerated for years, has ruptured. The wound is now open to the bone. You hear someone mutter that the king's flesh is turning sweet, not in the poetic sense, more like overripe meat. Insects have been spotted circling the chamber. A page boy swats at something near the drapes and tries to hide his gag reflex. Here's a curious historical aside for you. Some contemporary sources mentioned that Henry had to be wheeled around in a special mechanical chair near the end of his life. He couldn't walk, couldn't dress himself, and reportedly lashed out at those who helped him. The iron will that once defied popes and toppled monasteries now just kicks the closest servant in a fit of frustration. A monarch undone by his own mobility scooter. You wonder if he's dreaming right now, perhaps, of past glories, jousting tournaments, or his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, whom he later discarded like a stained tablecloth. If ghosts linger in the mind, Henry's are already gathering. Anne Boleyn's headless shadow might be lurking just outside the room. Someone at the window coughs deliberately. Perhaps he says delicately, "We should send for the Archbishop now." The room falls silent. This is the moment. Everyone looks at everyone else, silently urging someone else to agree. At last, a higher-ranking noble nods. A page is dispatched with haste. You exhale. Finally, something resembling a decision. Then a strange thing happens. A small tremor moves through Henry's massive body. Not breath, not will, just air. His bowels release. The stench is immediate and profound. A murmur runs through the room. One man leaves without a word. Another vomits quietly into a potted plant. The king has not yet been declared dead. But to your senses, it's abundantly clear he's already gone. You lean against the wall and consider how absurd all of this is. The most powerful man in England, conqueror of lands and destroyer of monasteries, leaking into his bedsheets, while a room full of terrified aristocrats pretends nothing is happening. History books often brush past these details. They skip to the date of death, the tomb, the politics. But this is the reality of royal death. Messy, slow, pathetic. You don't die a king, you die a sack of meat like anyone else. And that brings us to a curious moment of reflection, doesn't it? Whisper. 1 in the comments below if this tale charms your heart, or 2 if it sends shivers down your spine. Now the Archbishop still hasn't arrived. The night drags on. Somewhere downstairs a fire crackles. Upstairs, the King of England is decomposing. And still, no one dares to say it. By now, it's afternoon. The light streaming through the narrow windows has shifted from pale silver to a dull golden haze. In most homes, this would be the hour of warmth and bread and idle gossip. But in this royal bedchamber, the only thing rising is tension, and perhaps a bit more fluid from under the bed. The corpse has become the centerpiece of a bizarre courtly dance. One servant gently adjusts the sheets not to comfort the king, but to keep the smell from escaping too fast. Another adds more herbs to the stone fireplace, which does nothing but add a smoky scent to the foul cocktail already lingering in the air. It's like burning a candle in a barn full of wet laundry and rotting meat, and yet no one opens a door. The archbishop still hasn't arrived. And now there's a new problem. Rumors are already seeping through the palace. Servants talk, pages whisper. Someone's cousin who empties the night chamber pot says the king hasn't moved all day. Another says his lips are blue. One swears they saw rats in the corridor. Whether that's true or not, you can't tell. But what is true, the silence is cracking. Then it happens. A muffled voice. Lord Wriothesley, if you're catching names, steps into the middle of the room and says what no one else dares. We must begin preparations. There it is. No. He's dead. No dramatic declaration. Just. The quiet shift from waiting to moving. The court collectively exhales. You almost feel the whole palace exhale with them. Now things begin in earnest. A flurry of activity erupts. Not loud, not chaotic, but brisk and businesslike. Henry VIII, once larger than life, now reduced to a series of urgent tasks. Find a coffin, prepare the royal announcement, contact the Privy Council, and for heaven's sake, seal the windows. As the courtiers finally begin addressing the obvious, you notice something else shift the expressions on their faces. They're no longer afraid of his death, they're now afraid of what comes after, because with Henry gone, the real trouble begins. Here's your historical fun fact: Henry's death wasn't made public until 2 days later. During that time, his court acted as if he were still alive. Meals were delivered to his chamber. Official documents were backdated. The royal physicians continued to check on him. All a performance designed to stall chaos for just a bit longer. Even now, the groom of the stool hasn't returned. Smart man. You watch as a group of nobles begin debating over the order of events: who will speak first, who will ride to fetch Edward, who will handle the heralds. They speak in hushed tones, but the undertone is sharp. Ambition is rising in the silence Henry has left behind. One noble mentions something about not summoning Lady Mary until the will is properly reviewed. Another brings up Anne of Cleves, of all people. You're reminded that Henry had 6 wives, most of whom ended in either annulment execution or awkward retirement. You half expect their ghosts to float in one by one, arms crossed and eyes narrowed. You take a seat on an ornate bench near the edge of the room, careful to avoid a strange stain on the cushion. A scribe nearby is already drafting the official announcement, starting with the traditional flourish. It hath pleased Almighty God to call unto his mercy the most high and mighty prince. You roll your eyes. It would be more honest to say, the king is leaking into the bedclothes, and it's becoming a health hazard. But no, this is Tudor England. Appearances must be kept. Even as the curtains are changed, even as fresh linens are fetched, even as the guards are told to keep their mouths shut, no one says the word decay. Not aloud. That word, like dead, is still too final. You hear a priest enter and begin a soft prayer over the body. It's more ritual than reality. Henry's soul, if one believes in such things, is likely already en route, hopefully somewhere area. You might be wondering why all this delay. Why the fear? Well, scholars still debate whether the silence after his death was an orchestrated plan or a chaotic accident. Was it about political strategy or fear of public reaction? Or perhaps it was simply the weight of legacy. So many feared Henry while alive that even his corpse kept them paralyzed. Tap 3 in the comments below if this story makes you smile, or 4 if it leaves you chilled. Outside the windows, the sky is darkening, and with it comes a shift in energy. The king may be dead, but the game is just beginning. Who will take power? Who will rise? And how long until someone starts rewriting history? For now, though, you stay seated, quiet and unseen. You survived the worst of the smell. You're surviving the worst of the politics. But trust me, things are about to get stranger. By nightfall, the palace has turned into a stage set for denial. The scent of decay is stronger now, richer somehow, like overcooked pork left in the sun. But that doesn't stop the court from clinging to their rituals. You stand near the edge of the king's chamber, as the door creaks open once more this time, not for a priest or physician, but for an unfortunate crew of servants, holding polished brass basins and stiff expressions. They're here to refresh the room. You know what that means. Clearing the linens, folding towels, tossing rose petals on damp floors. Tiny gestures meant to make a royal deathbed look less like a crime scene. One servant gags discreetly as he approaches the side of the bed. You catch a glimpse of what he sees, a sagging bandage oozing through the sheets, a puddle too large to pretend it's just sweat. Still, no one says dead. The courtiers use euphemisms now. His Majesty rests, or his condition is stable. One noble even mutters, "The king is in God's hands now," with a theatrical sigh, as though they haven't been watching him rot for 12 hours. The groom of the stool, still tucked in the corner, seems to mock everyone with its silence. You edge toward the fireplace. The logs there haven't been touched in hours. The flames are faint and lazy, but the embers still glow enough to make shadows dance along the tapestries. You watch the flicker of one St. George slaying the dragon. Fitting. Except the dragon in this case died in bed, and no one wants to touch the corpse. And now comes one of the strangest customs in the room. The royal room of horrors is about to be blessed. A priest finally enters to begin a cleansing rite. He walks slowly, swinging a censer, sending tendrils of smoke and myrrh into the air. It fights the stench, but loses quickly. Behind him, a scribe reads from a parchment. The words don't match the scene. His Majesty's spirit soars to heaven, lifted by righteousness and glory. You glance at the bed. The only thing soaring here is bacterial vapor. One courtier whispers that they should perhaps remove the body. Another replies, "Not until the coffin arrives." Right, the coffin. It was supposed to be ready yesterday, but Henry's dimensions required a special one. Larger, lead-lined, reinforced to handle a body that had grown uncooperative long before death. As of this hour, it's still en route from Windsor. Meanwhile, the servants try to mop around the bed, keeping a careful distance. One slips slightly and curses under his breath. You look down. The floorboards are damp. And now here's a curious bit of fringe history, some accounts claim. Henry's body began to burst in the night. Yes, burst. The pressure of internal gases combined with ulcerated tissue and poor embalming reportedly caused liquids to spill from the coffin later while in transit. That hasn't happened yet, but the air in this room already feels charged. Like a balloon filled too far, ready to pop. One of the Queen's old ladies in waiting enters quietly and stands near the bed. She crosses herself, then murmurs something too soft to hear. Maybe a prayer, maybe an apology. You study her face. There's something in it, relief. Maybe Henry was not an easy man to serve. Volatile, paranoid, cruel. He sent friends to the scaffold and queens to the block. He destroyed monasteries, bankrupted his court, rewrote religion. And now he lies here, bloated and still surrounded by men too afraid to say what everyone already knows. The lady in waiting steps back. Another noble enters. You recognize him, the Earl of Hertford, uncle to young Edward. He stands tall, sniffs once and says nothing, but his presence speaks volumes. The power handoff has begun. As the fire gutters and the priests drone, you find a chair against the wall and settle in. It's odd how numb you've grown to the smell. Or maybe your senses have just given up. Either way, the air feels thicker, heavier. You wonder how much of that weight is Henry himself, and how much is the legacy he leaves behind. Because you sense it now, don't you? His death isn't the end. It's a beginning. The vacuum of power. The rush to fill it. The petty nobles sharpening their smiles. The secret letters. The alliances whispered in corners. And beneath it all, the body. Rotting quietly while history shuffles its cards. You close your eyes for a moment, just long enough to pretend none of this is real. But then you hear something shift. The bed creaks. A new scent hits your nose, sharper, sourer. Someone swears under their breath. You open your eyes. Something's leaking again. You're no longer shocked by the leaking. That's just part of the scenery now. In fact, as far as Tudor royal rituals go, the leaks might be the only thing that's honest. Everyone else in the room continues to posture, pretend, and breathe through their mouths. But beneath the layers of denial and rosewater lies one inescapable truth. Henry is deteriorating faster than the political situation outside his bedroom. And speaking of truths you can't unlearn, have you met the groom of the stool? You glance toward the foot of the bed, where his small stool lined with velvet and oddly regal sits unattended. Its owner is notably absent, likely hiding in a less pungent wing of the palace. His job, as the title suggests, was not a joke. He literally managed the king's toilet duties. Wiping, washing, fetching the basin. It was a high-trust position with shocking intimacy. In fact, many grooms of the stool were powerful advisors privy to royal secrets whispered mid-defecation. You look at the stool again. No one wants to sit there now. The irony hangs thick. Henry, who once held Europe's gaze, who crafted a whole new church just to swap wives now, has a chamber that smells like spoiled beef stew and politics and a toilet servant too horrified to return. One courtier jokes weakly about bringing in more oranges to counter the odour. Another suggests opening the chimney flue for better airflow. A third recommends prayer, though he says it while pinching his nose. Meanwhile, preparations for removal begin. The carpenter arrives, red-faced and sweating. You watch him measure the room, then the bed, then the body, carefully, discreetly, as if hoping Henry might not notice from beyond the veil. Turns out, Henry's corpse is now too swollen for even the enlarged coffin they did bring. You hear a muttered exchange. It won't fit. Make it fit. With a crowbar. They settle on modifying the bed frame, hoping to ease the transition. You try not to think too hard about what that means. Outside the chamber, the palace is stirring. You hear the rustle of armor, the click of boots, the whisper of servants running messages. Word hasn't officially broken yet, but the walls have ears. The people know. They just don't know they know. Here's your quirky Tudor tidbit of the day. There were official king's body servants whose job was to move and tend to the monarch's corpse. They even had to dry the remains, wrap them, and seal them inside wax cloth. That job. It's beginning in about 20 minutes, and no one in this room has volunteered. The groom of the stool is still missing. You don't blame him. Back inside the chamber, the scent has evolved. No longer just rot. There's a bitter edge now, like ammonia or damp wool set on fire. One of the younger nobles begins to cry quietly into his glove, not for grief, but because his eyes are watering uncontrollably. The priests pause their chanting to fan themselves with rolled-up scrolls. A court musician, inexplicably present, begins to softly strum a lute in the corner. It's unclear why, possibly panic. The conversation turns to how Henry should be moved. One proposal involves wrapping him tightly in sheets soaked with vinegar and pitch. Another noble dryly suggests using the tablecloth from the Great Hall. No one laughs. It's about this moment that the groom of the stool finally reappears, pale, sweating, and clearly regretting every career decision that led to this point. He approaches the bed like a man approaching a sleeping lion, except this lion smells like spoiled mutton and is already dead. He says nothing, just nods toward the sheets and begins assisting the body servants with reluctant professionalism. You feel oddly moved. In a world where nobles lie and doctors stammer, here's someone just doing the grim job he was trained to do, cleaning up after the king, even if the king is dripping. And here lies a curious scholarly debate. Some historians believe the groom of the stool may have been Henry's closest confidant in his final years. Not the nobles, not the bishops, but the man who helped him sit on a padded box every morning. The theory remains debated, but if true, it says more about intimacy and trust in Tudor power than 100 royal decrees. You watch the groom gently wipe away a stain from the bedpost with a cloth. A small, meaningless gesture, but somehow the most human one in hours. And then movement. They're going to try lifting him. The tension in the room tightens like a drum. 4 men step forward, 2 body servants, 1 carpenter and the groom. Each one grabs a corner, eyes wide. You brace yourself. Somewhere in the distance, you swear the lute hits a minor chord. With a grunt and a squelch, they begin. You close your eyes. Better not to watch. There's a sound you don't forget. Not once you've heard it. It's the combination of wet cloth peeling from skin wood, creaking under unnatural weight, and 4 grown men collectively realizing they may not be paid enough to lift a decomposing king. You hear all of that now layered over the whispered prayers of nearby priests and the strained breathing of the groom of the stool. Henry VIII is being moved. Slowly, carefully, sloppily. The sheet-wrapped bulk rises just a few inches from the bed before one of the body servants lets out a grunt, more panic than effort, and they all stagger to rebalance. You instinctively step back, avoiding a dark splatter that drips onto the rug. No one reacts. Everyone saw it. No one wants to acknowledge it. The men lower him onto a reinforced wooden platform, what is effectively a temporary sled. It groans under the weight. One of the handles snaps slightly, sending another wave of murmured curses around the chamber. No one says why the handles are so strained. They just keep moving and pretending. As they do, you catch the look on one nobleman's face, thin lips, pressed tight eyes, locked not on the body, but on the parchment in his hands. It's a copy of the king's unsigned will. They're still figuring out who should pretend they saw him sign it. Legal fictions are easier when everyone's nose deep in denial. You're watching history unfold, and it's more tragicomedy than grand opera. One of the guards opens the chamber doors at last. A blast of cooler air floods in, and for a brief moment the scent inside lightens. You take a deep breath and regret it instantly. The corridor isn't much better. The stench clings to fabric, to wood, even to breath. It's as if Henry himself is resisting being removed. They begin the procession down the hallway. This isn't the grand funeral yet. That comes later with banners, black horses and cannon salutes. No, this is the secret move, the behind-the-scenes shuffle of the monarch's corpse before the kingdom is ready to admit he's gone. The platform scrapes softly as it moves. Behind it, small droplets mark the trail on the flagstones. You think about the servants who'll have to clean that later. You follow the group down the hallway, flanked by flickering torches and pale guards trying to look anywhere but at the body. At one turn, a page steps too close and slips slightly. His shoe lands in something that definitely isn't wax. He goes white, apologizes to no one in particular, and dashes off down another hall. You round a corner and notice a cluster of courtiers ahead whispering in the half-dark. They fall silent when they see the corpse approach. One woman, perhaps a lesser duchess, curtsies low. Another simply turns and walks away. This, it seems, is what royal death looks like behind the curtain. And now the body must be secured for travel. You enter a smaller room, stone walls, narrow windows, no paintings. This is the transition space, the in-between, the liminal chamber where monarchs become meat and where servants must prepare for the real ceremony later. Here 4 new men wait. They're dressed differently, coarser tunics, gloves to the elbows, aprons already stained. These are the corpse handlers, the quiet professionals who don't flinch when the smell arrives with the door. They nod, briefly. Then one says, "We'll need to repack him." You blink, repack. And so begins the next strange, disturbing chapter, preparing the royal remains for movement to Windsor. Here's your historical fact. Embalming was rarely practiced for royalty at the time, and when it was, it often failed. Henry's body was treated with rudimentary preservatives, cloth, pitch, herbs, but it was already too late. The swelling, the ulcerations, the infection, it had all gone too far. He was by most accounts spoiling. The cloth-wrapped bundle is slowly stripped. You don't look. You refuse to look. But the sounds you hear. The handlers work quickly. They replace soaked linen with new sheets dipped in myrrh and wine. They coat the body in a layer of beeswax, part ritual, part desperate attempt to seal things in. The pitch is reheated over a small brazier and brushed along the seams of the shroud. It smells like hot tar and spoiled meat. You want to leave the room, but you can't. Morbid curiosity is stronger than nausea now. And in all this silence, all this solemn movement, the only words spoken aloud come from the groom of the stool. Softly, almost to himself, he mutters, "He always hated drafts." No one responds. But several pause, as if remembering something small and absurd. You see it in their faces. Even now this grotesque, bloated man was still the king. The man who ruled their lives, dictated their fates, ruined or raised entire families. Now he lies on a board, rewrapped like meat at a butcher's stall, leaking through the linens. You look at him one last time, and then someone says, "Ready." They begin moving him again, this time not with caution, but with intent. The hush of the palace corridors is broken by the shuffle of boots, the low groan of the wheeled cart beneath the weight of England's most infamous monarch, and the rustling of cloaks as courtiers discreetly press themselves to the walls. No trumpets, no ceremonial flourish, just the quiet clatter of urgent logistics wrapped in layers of linen and wax. You walk behind the procession now, each step echoing faintly in the long gallery that leads out of the private royal chambers. The torches along the walls flicker uneasily, as though nervous in the presence of Henry. Or maybe it's just the draft, the one he supposedly hated so much. The men at the front murmur to each other about the route. They're not taking him directly to the chapel yet. That would draw too much attention. Instead, they'll wheel the bloated king through a back passage, an old servants' corridor that smells of mildew and boiled onions. It's humiliating, really, but necessary. Henry's body isn't in a state to lie in glory. Not yet. It needs to be sealed, stored, and prayed over before anyone sees the full extent of nature's revenge. You pass a mirror. A long, cracked looking-glass covered with a sheet of black cloth. Superstition, mostly. In Tudor England, it was said that a mirror could trap the soul of the dead if left uncovered. And no one wanted Henry's soul stuck staring back at them from the hallway wall. Behind you, one of the younger servants whispers, "Is he, Kai, still leaking?" The reply comes dryly. Does it matter? And yet it does. Because each trail, each drop, each unfortunate stain is another clue that the king is no longer kingly. The ritual has begun to outpace the reality. The court wants pageantry. What they have is seepage. And you begin to realize something else. The will. It still hasn't been signed. The document lies in the hands of Lord Hertford, rolled and sealed blank, where Henry's shaky hand was supposed to rest. A few members of the Privy Council are quietly meeting in another wing of the palace to discuss what Henry would have wanted, which in Tudor English roughly translates to, "How do we not get executed if this goes wrong?" There's a heavy political question hanging over the hallway, and you can feel it in every tense face you pass. Who is king now, Edward? He's 9. Intelligent, yes, but pale and sickly. Easily influenced. A dream for power-hungry uncles. Mary dangerous. Catholic. Not the first choice for those invested in Henry's religious reforms. Elizabeth. She's only 13, clever, already showing steel, but years away from serious rule. And so the nobles murmur in corners and scribble letters in haste. You hear snippets. Dudley has a plan. Norfolk is moving troops. The will must be read tonight. The power vacuum left by Henry is beginning to howl, and no one is ready. Outside now, the cold air hits you like a blessing. For the first time in what feels like days, your lungs fill with something other than death. The platform creaks across the stone courtyard as it makes its way toward the cryptic side entrance near the chapel. You glance around. It's almost dark. Only a few stars have begun to prick the sky, but already the shadows seem to stretch and twist, curling like black vines around the base of the towers. It's fitting. Henry's death isn't just a royal event, it's an eclipse. A heavy curtain falling on an era of monstrous decisions. And yet, not everyone mourns. A kitchen servant, watching from the edge of the courtyard, crosses himself. Yes, but then disappears inside, perhaps smiling. A young maid clutches a scarf to her nose, but you see her eyes bright, curious, even a little relieved. Henry's reign brought fear, change, execution, and unpredictable storms. His death might bring calm or chaos. As the procession rounds the chapel, one wheel gets stuck in the uneven stone. A sickening tilt sends the cart rocking. The body shifts. You hear a wet squelch and a collective intake of breath. A muffled curse. But no one stops. They just grip tighter and keep moving. You pause at the chapel door. Inside lies a temporary resting place. Candles flicker on iron sconces, and the altar has been hastily cleared of its usual finery. No one planned for this part. Not really. Everyone imagined a noble death, a priest beside the bed, final words recorded for posterity. Instead, they have linen pitch and silence. The platform slides into place, a final heave, a strained breath, then it stops. The men step back, the room stills, and in this quiet space with cold air licking the stone, someone finally speaks aloud. The king is dead. No fanfare, just the truth delivered too late. You step back from the altar and let the moment settle like dust. So now it's official. But don't expect a sudden wave of grief or a flood of mourners in black silk robes. No, the mood in the chapel is more bureaucratic. The king is dead, and now comes the paperwork. You stand near the altar as 2 scribes unpack their inkwells, unfurl their scrolls, and begin listing the death as if logging an overdue shipment of wine. One of them is already drafting the announcement to the realm. It hath pleased Almighty God, the standard opening. Flowery, formulaic, and completely detached from the very real puddle drying beneath the royal bier. No one mentions the stains. What you witness now is the formal performance of death. Henry's real death, as you know, happened quietly in the night, ignored by those too terrified to name it. This is death with props, death in costume. And the first act is to make sure everyone gets their lines right. Meanwhile, the body's being placed into a coffin, or rather the coffin. It's enormous lead-lined, as mentioned, sealed with pitch. Heavy. Very, very heavy. It takes 6 men to slide him in, and even then there's resistance. Like he's not quite ready to fit. You hear one of the handlers mutter, "He's swelling again." Another suggests packing herbs around the edges to cushion the shape. They do. Rosemary, bay leaves, lavender. It's like stuffing a turkey that fought back. Then comes the lid. It closes with a thud that echoes through the chapel like a final insult. A thick iron band is hammered around the edge, not for security, just insurance. Because no one wants this coffin to leak during the public procession. And history tells us that despite best efforts, it does exactly that. Yes, here comes the infamous tale. 2 weeks from now, as the coffin lies in state at Sion Abbey, dark fluid will reportedly seep from beneath the lead seal. According to one chronicler, a dog entered the chapel and licked it. Now, did that really happen? Scholars remain divided. Some believe it's apocryphal, an anti-Tudor smear from later Protestant writers. Others think it's plausible. After all, decomposition waits for no one, and Henry's body had already started the process well before burial. Back in the chapel, someone has finally summoned the heralds. They arrive in dark red tunics, carrying the official regalia, the sword of state, the crown imperial, the orb, symbols of monarchy, of control, of power slipping like sand from a bloated hand. The youngest herald steps forward to place the items beside the coffin. He hesitates. You can tell he doesn't want to get too close. Can't blame him. There's something about the air near the coffin, something not just putrid but charged, as if the rot inside carries more than just decay. Maybe it's memory, or maybe it's fear. And as the heralds begin the formal proclamation, you notice something odd. They're speaking as if Henry were still alive. Not in tense, no, they've got the past tense down, but in tone, as if honouring a wise king, a father of the realm, a stabilising force. You want to laugh. Henry VIII stabilising. The man who turned marriage into roulette, who changed national religion because the Pope wouldn't let him remarry, who bankrupted his realm chasing glory and gowns. But no one here laughs. Because history, like wax, can be reshaped. And the reshaping begins now. Someone brings in a painter. Yes, a painter. The man stands back, sketchpad in hand, studying the sealed coffin from an angle. He's not here to paint the body god, no, but to draft ideas for the death portrait. The grand oil painting that will hang in a hall somewhere, showing Henry in noble repose, serene, regal, unleaking. They'll skip this part of the story, the part with the linen and pitch and exploding ulcers. They'll paint him in armour, or maybe in his coronation robes, surrounded by golden light and symbols of strength. You move to the back of the chapel and watch as a candle is lit near the coffin's head, then another, and another. Soon the body is surrounded by a halo of flames. The room glows with soft light flickering across the faces of nobles, who now act solemn, reverent, collected. But you were there last night. You know the truth. You glance one last time at the coffin, at the floor beneath it, at the men already rehearsing the speech they'll give when the people ask what kind of king he was. You already know the answer. One who still manages to make a mess even after death. They say royal death is supposed to be dignified, sacred, cloaked in ritual and calm, as though the monarch drifts away like mist over a lake. But you've just seen the opposite. And now as the travelling corpse begins its journey across England, the kingdom itself is forced into a strange performance, one part theatre, one part hygiene crisis. It begins at sunrise. The coffin, newly sealed and ringed in iron, is loaded onto a state wagon, a lumbering, heavily adorned structure pulled by 6 black horses. Its drapes are velvet, its corners glint with polished brass. But none of that matters really, because inside lies a ticking time bomb of royal rot. You join the growing entourage as it snakes its way out of the palace gates. The streets are already lined with curious onlookers, peasants, tradesmen, children on shoulders, all dressed in their Sunday worst. Most don't yet know that the king is dead. Not officially. But the sight of a velvet-draped wagon followed by a small army of lords in black is hard to misinterpret. No bells yet. That will come later. For now, the goal is discretion. You hear a hushed conversation between 2 riders. How long to Windsor? Depends how often we have to stop. And clean. Clean. You glance toward the rear of the coffin wagon. There, discreetly hidden behind the wheel axle, hangs a cloth bag filled with powdered herbs. Not for ceremony, for absorption. Let's be clear, Henry VIII's body is not travelling peacefully. Inside that box, decomposition continues. Pressure builds. The pitch seal is holding for now, but it won't forever. And with every bump in the road, every lurch of the wheels, the chances increase that the most powerful man in England will seep. Here's a historical detail you'll wish you could forget. Tudor mortuary wagons weren't sealed like modern hearses. They were just ornately covered carts, meaning odours and worse could still escape. And so the wagon winds its way out of London, past crumbling walls and muddy taverns, past churchyards, where the people bow and cross themselves as the funeral train passes. A few men remove their hats. One woman tosses a sprig of rosemary at the wheels. You see it catch for a moment, then disappear beneath a rear hoof. Inside the wagon, the weight shifts again. You hear it. A dull thump. The horses spook slightly. One of the guards curses under his breath. You walk alongside close enough now to see the corners of the coffin darkening slightly. At first you think it's just shadow. Then you smell it. Vinegar. Blood. Something sweet and terrifying. They've packed him with spices, but even cloves have their limits. There's a stop scheduled at Sion Abbey, an ancient monastery converted into a royal resting point. That's where they'll change the wrappings, light candles, and pretend everything is proceeding according to plan. But you already know what's coming. Because at Sion, something happens. Something people will whisper about for decades. You arrive as the sun begins to drop behind the trees. The procession slows. The cart wheels grind to a stop before the abbey's massive oak doors. Monks in black robes line the walkway, chanting softly in Latin. They bow their heads. They hold their noses subtly. And then, as the coffin is lowered onto the abbey bier, drip. It's faint, but it's there. A dark, oozing trail emerges beneath the lead casing. Not much. Just enough to turn the flagstones slick. Just enough to stain the altar cloth beneath the casket. Just enough to become legend. Here's the folklore you've been waiting for. According to a 16th century account, a stray dog entered the abbey that night. It sniffed the coffin, licked the leaked fluids, then howled and fled. Some say it was a symbol that even animals recoiled from Henry's death. Others think it was metaphorical part of the Protestant movement's propaganda against the old Catholic-leaning king. Others, they just think the story stuck because it's gross and weird. Scholars remain divided, as always. But the stain is real. You see it. You step around it carefully. You watch as two monks pretend it's candle wax. One even tries to mop it with a cloth that immediately begins to smoke when it touches the pitch. No one mentions it again. That night the coffin remains in the abbey chapel. Candles are placed at each corner. Psalms are sung. Air is burned thick with frankincense. But beneath the pomp you know the truth. They're just trying to keep the smell from creeping into the nave. You step back from the bier and listen to the monks chant a Latin hymn for the soul of the king. But even over the singing you can hear it. A faint drip. Again, morning at Sion Abbey begins with a lingering fog, and not just the kind that hangs low over the grass. Inside the chapel the atmosphere is damp, smoky, and faintly metallic. The monks are already awake, quietly moving about in slow practiced patterns. But every so often one of them glances at the coffin, more specifically at the corner of the coffin where the flagstone has darkened overnight. You inch closer. The stain is bigger now. The lead seal hasn't burst yet, but something inside has begun to break down more dramatically. Whether it's pressure rot or divine commentary, the coffin has started to weep. A slow, dark ooze pools beneath it, thick and sticky, almost tar-like. The abbey has placed fresh linen under the casket, but it's soaked through already. One monk crosses himself. Another mutters something about St. Edmund's relics being disturbed. No one, of course, says the king is leaking. Not out loud. You take a deep breath and move closer. The air near the coffin is warmer than it should be. Faintly sour, laced with dried rosemary, and something more human-like pork left in vinegar. You glance at a nearby candle. The wax is melting unevenly. Something about this room feels wrong, tilted, unnatural. You're not alone in that feeling. There's a growing nervousness among the clergy. Last night the monks chanted prayers with solemn ease. Today they look like they're performing an exorcism. One even suggests placing holy water near the coffin's feet. Just in case, he says. You ask what he means. He doesn't answer. Now here's a strange historical aside for you. This very abbey had been suppressed by Henry years earlier during his dissolution of the monasteries. The nuns and monks were expelled, lands seized, liturgical books burned. Only recently had some of the monastic orders returned, and now the man responsible for their ruin lies rotting on their altar. You sense irony curling through the air like the incense smoke. Was this poetic justice a final insult? Or just the logistical result of needing a big, cool building between London and Windsor? Experts still debate whether the abbey was chosen for its convenience or its symbolism. Some claim it was the only building nearby, with a sufficiently grand interior for an overnight display. Others whisper it was a deliberate act of grim penance. Henry's final apology oozing through the floorboards. No one knows for sure. What you do know is this: a decision is made. The monks will not leave the coffin in the chapel another night. The Privy Council, still travelling ahead to prepare Windsor for the final interment, had wanted 2 full days of solemn vigil. But the monks here, they've had enough. You overhear one mutter, "If he stays another night, the entire nave will need consecrating again." The court agrees, quietly, firmly. And so another hasty departure is arranged. Servants arrive with bundles of dried herbs, wrapping them around the bottom of the casket like one might pack sandbags around a flooding door. A new layer of cloth is tied tightly around the base. Less for dignity, more for absorption. The horses are brought around again. The wagon, newly scrubbed, is still stained. As they prepare to move the coffin, one of the monks pulls you aside. "He said we were traitors," the monk whispers. "Called us rebels. Sent our brothers to the gallows." You nod. You know. And now he lies here, in our chapel. You don't respond. Because what can you say? There's no real justice here. Just mess and weight, and the stench of history refusing to lie still. The coffin is loaded again. The abbey bells toll not for death, but for departure. You step into the courtyard as the wagon creaks forward. The guards keep a tighter formation this time. Word is beginning to spread. People are whispering in towns and marketplaces. The king is dead. The king is leaking. The king is heading to Windsor. And that coffin still oozing. The sun glints faintly off the brass handles. You catch a glimpse of pitch smeared along the edge. It bubbles slightly in the heat. You realize with a shudder it's going to get worse before it gets buried. You ride just behind the coffin now. The air is sharper in the countryside. Less crowded, less corrupted, but still faintly tinged with something sour trailing behind the funeral wagon. The horses seem agitated today. Their ears twitch. Their hooves clip the stones nervously. It's as if they know they're hauling more than just a corpse. They're pulling history that refuses to stay quiet. The road to Windsor stretches long and bumpy, winding through bare fields and mossy hedgerows. Spring hasn't arrived yet, and the trees are skeletal against a pale sky. The wind nips at your sleeves. You'd call it peaceful if it weren't for the rhythmic creak of wheels and the occasional thud from inside the coffin. Yes, thud. It happens every few miles now. A shift, a bump, and then a hollow knock, as if Henry himself is rolling slightly. Not quite enough to crack the seal, but certainly enough to jostle nerves. You glance toward the driver of the wagon. He's young, pale, and gripping the reins like his hands are glued. Every time the thud comes, his jaw tightens. You don't ask him how he feels. His face says it all. The entourage is smaller now. Many nobles rode ahead to Windsor to prepare for the ceremonies. Only a core group remains: servants, guards, and 1 or 2 advisors who've drawn the short straw of corpse duty. No one talks much anymore. There's not much left to say that doesn't sound like an apology to the air. Then, without warning, the wagon lurches. The rear left wheel drops into a shallow ditch. The whole coffin tilts sideways. Tilt is a soft word for what you see. The seal on the bottom edge gives out with a wet, sucking pop. The iron band groans. And then, well, you wouldn't call it an explosion, but let's just say the coffin breathes out. A sudden putrid puff of air hisses from the wood. Everyone stops. The horses rear eyes wide. The cart rocks. A squire throws up behind a hedge. You don't move. You can't. Your legs won't listen, because the smell is biblical. Forget rotting meat. Forget spoiled milk. This is something older, deeper. It smells like betrayal, like sins cooked too long, like the body of a man who ruled in excess and now seeps in kind. The guards rally quickly. Someone shouts for more cloth. Another yells for the monk's herbs from the storage satchel. You watch as 3 men stuff rosemary into the crack like desperate florists on a deadline. It doesn't help, so they move. Quickly now. The procession skips the next rest point and pushes straight to Windsor. The sun is dropping and the wind has turned, but they don't stop. They won't stop. The king must be sealed in stone before nightfall, or before the coffin gives out completely. And now here's your historical fringe fact. Some sources claim the coffin's leakage at this stage forced officials to abandon the planned public lying in state at Windsor. Whether true or not, what's certain is that Henry's interment was rushed. No extended viewing, no grand procession inside the chapel. Just a brief ceremonial nod before lowering him into the vault. As Windsor Castle comes into view on the hill, its towers catching the fading light, you begin to feel the weight of finality creeping in. The guards straighten up. The priests begin singing again, low and nervous. The coffin is still oozing, but they're almost there. The gates of the lower ward open wide, and the air changes. Inside the chapel, the clergy have prepared a sealed stone vault deep beneath the choir of St. Teeson's cell. George's chapel. It was meant to be temporary, but he's still there today. Buried beside Jane Seymour, his true wife, the only one to bear him a son. Not that she had much choice in the matter. The wagon pulls into the castle yard wheels thick with mud and grief. You dismount and walk the final steps beside the casket. It looks smaller now. Perhaps it's the light, perhaps it's your exhaustion, or perhaps the man inside is finally done fighting. The chapel doors swing open, and now they carry him by hand. No wagon, no squeaking wheels. Just 6 men red-faced and trembling, hauling the bloated legacy of a king down into the stone belly of England's royal crypt. The echo of boots on flagstone follows you down the winding steps. The smell oddly doesn't. Maybe it's the thick walls, maybe it's mercy. Inside the vault the temperature drops. The torches flicker, and in the center lies the dark slab ready to receive him. He is lowered, slowly, carefully. This time no thud. You step back. The lid slides into place. The coughing stops. The sweating stops. The leaking finally stops. And so ends the most grotesque journey of royal remains in English history. You stare at the stone. No inscription yet. No fanfare. Just silence. It's done. Or so everyone tells themselves. You stand in the cool hush of St. George's Chapel, watching as dust settles on the newly sealed tomb. The stone slab is unmarked, the royal arms not yet carved. For now, the only indication that Henry VIII lies beneath is the absence of noise. No orders barked, no feet thudding. Just the deep collective silence of a nation that's finally holding its breath again because the king has finally stopped. Outside, the sun has vanished. Dusk bleeds through the stained glass windows. Red and gold stretch across the pews like spilled wine glinting off armor and velvet robes. The nobles stand quietly in rows, trying their best to look composed and sorrowful. But behind their black gloves and solemn nods, they're doing calculations, plotting alignments, testing smiles. Because with Henry's death, the real game begins. His heir, Edward VI, is only 9. Bright, yes. Educated, certainly. But so pale, so thin, so easily moulded. Already you've heard the whispers, who will guide him, who will rule for him, which faction will rise. Now that the throne is wide open for influence, and hovering behind that, what if Edward doesn't survive? You shift your gaze from the nobles to the tomb. If anyone was supposed to plan for succession, it was Henry. And he tried. He wrote will after will, proclamation after proclamation. But in typical Tudor fashion, even his last legal document remains unfinished, unwitnessed. Maybe forged, maybe not. The Privy Council will spend the next several weeks pretending it was signed quietly, ensuring it's interpreted in ways that suit their needs. And that's the most Henry thing of all, isn't it? Leaving behind a kingdom full of contradiction and confusion, a legacy stitched together with bold declarations and political duct tape. You sit down in a dark wooden pew. Let's take stock, shall we? This man, this mountain of a monarch, had 6 wives. 2 divorced, 2 beheaded, 1 dead in childbirth, and 1 who outlived him, mostly by staying very, very quiet. He had 3 children by 3 different queens, and none of them were ever expected to rule when he first took the crown. He broke from the Pope-dissolved monasteries, founded a new church. All because Rome wouldn't let him swap out his queen for a fresher model. He made England Protestant, but never really wanted to be Protestant. He banned Latin in services, then demanded Latin in his own funeral rites. He waged war's printed propaganda, executed friends, burned heretics, and composed love songs. He ate himself into immobility. He ordered portraits that trimmed 30 pounds off his face. And now he's decomposing in silence, buried next to the wife he liked best, only because she died before he could get tired of her. And yet, despite all that, despite the mess, the smell, the uncertainty, they're calling him Henry the Great. It starts with one noble, then another. A bishop offers a prayer praising his mighty hand and unshakable rule. A steward refers to him as England's lion. The choir sings about noble blood that saved the realm. You almost choke because you know the truth. You saw the linens. You heard the popping seal. You smelled the legacy oozing into the floorboards. But history prefers tidy endings. And this will become one. A sanitized version served to generations in golden frames. Scholars remain divided on whether Henry's myth was crafted in earnest or out of fear. Some argue he earned his place among England's legendary rulers. Others believe it was necessity, a kingdom that couldn't afford to admit how unstable its greatest monarch had truly become. As you rise from the pew, you glance once more at the tomb. No crown, no sculpture, just stone. And underneath gasbone cloth wax blood regret. You exit the chapel into the cool evening air. The wind has picked up. Church bells ring in the distance, not for mourning but for closure. The people want to believe the chapter has ended, but you know better. Henry is gone. But his shadow is just getting started. The shadow stretches far. Even as the tomb settles into stone stillness, the kingdom outside is anything but. You walk through Windsor's upper corridors now, where voices are muffled behind thick oak doors and courtiers huddle in corners, clutching parchment like lifelines. The air is thick with something new urgency. Because the king may be buried, but his throne is wide open, and the vultures have already begun to circle. You peek into a side chamber just in time to see a group of nobles clustered around a table, lit only by flickering candlelight. Their voices are low, their expressions pinched. Lord Hertford is their Edward's uncle, and he's clearly leading the discussion, or rather the campaign. You catch one phrase, "We must move swiftly before Norfolk recovers," and another, "Mary cannot be allowed to challenge the regency." There it is. The next phase. Henry VIII's death has created a power vacuum. And in a court full of men trained to survive Henry's mood swings, no one's going to let a little thing like mourning slow them down. You get the sense that some of these men were writing letters and preparing alliances before the body cooled. You pause in a gallery hung with massive tapestries, scenes of war and glory lions and saints kings with halos. Beneath your feet, somewhere deep in the stone, lies the bloated wax-sealed body of Henry, and above it, the makings of a scramble that could unravel the Tudor dynasty in one bad afternoon. Let's review the key players. First, Edward VI, the boy king. 9 years old, serious beyond his years, raised on Reformation ideals, fluent in Latin, and dangerously delicate in health. He's not ready to rule, everyone knows it, which makes him the perfect puppet. Next, his uncle Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford, soon to be named Lord Protector. Not because Henry loved him best, but because Seymour moved fastest, and because he was clever enough to surround himself with men who'd nod at the right moments. Then there's Lady Mary, Henry's eldest daughter, Catholic to the marrow, born of Catherine of Aragon, and legally restored to the succession, sort of. Her claim is strong, but her religion, unfashionable, and terrifying to a court that spent the last decade smashing saints and burning relics. And in the background, silent, for now, Princess Elizabeth, 13 years old, watchful, cautious. A Protestant like her half-brother, but too clever to speak when listening serves her better. No one knows yet how this will go, but they all feel the instability, and so across the palace letters fly. Some head to the north to summon troops, others to bishops asking for public support. Still more go to Spain and France, carefully worded to project calm strength unity. But you know, you were there. You saw how disunited the court was when they couldn't even announce the king's death for days. That kind of hesitation doesn't disappear overnight. It just hides beneath powdered wigs and iron sleeves. As you round a corner, you hear the faint tap-tap of quills. Inside a solar room, a team of scribes is busy rewriting history. Literally. They're drafting the official record of Henry's death. Not the rotting, leaking, whispering chaos you witnessed, but the clean version. The one that says he passed peacefully, surrounded by prayer, having confessed his sins and praised God with his final breath. One even reads aloud a line. And with grace the king commended his soul into the hands of the Almighty. You choke on your breath. That's not what happened. He gurgled. He slipped. His corpse oozed across 2 counties. But that version, it won't be copied into the books. The real Henry VIII won't live in the margins. He'll live in the narrative, smoothed, polished, fragrant, with incense and false memory. You wonder how many people in this castle even remember what truly happened anymore. Outside, bells begin to ring from the chapel again. You follow the sound, stepping into the courtyard just in time to see a herald addressing a growing crowd of townsfolk and travellers. He holds a scroll high and begins to read, "It hath pleased Almighty God to call unto his mercy our most gracious sovereign King Henry VIII." And there it is. The official version. No mention of bursting legs. No leaky coffins. No monastic side exits or patchwork linens soaked in pitch. Just a noble death. A strong king. A holy end. You scan the crowd. Some cry. Some look puzzled. One child asks why no one told them sooner. A merchant mutters something about taxes. Another man simply bows his head. You don't say a word. Because you know that what they believe matters more than what you saw. That's the nature of royal power. It doesn't end when the body is buried. It lingers, reshapes itself, and is retold through every trumpet scroll and polished phrase. And Henry VIII, more than most, understood this. He ruled by image. He shaped a nation not with subtlety but with spectacle. His death is no different. He's gone. But his myth, that's just getting started. You're awake before dawn, wandering the halls of Windsor, when you hear its soft footsteps on stone, the brush of fabric, and a door clicking shut too quickly. You follow instinct, not invitation, and find yourself outside a small room tucked beneath the main stairwell. No guards. No official markings. Just the faint flicker of candlelight under the door. You push it open, slow and silent. Inside sits Edward VI alone. Not on a throne. Not on a cushion. Just a straight-backed wooden chair beside a shuttered window, the candle on the table flickering against his pale, narrow face. He's staring down at a book in his lap, but you can tell he hasn't turned a page in a while. This is England's new king, and he looks absolutely terrified. You say nothing. He doesn't notice you at first. When he finally does, he straightens reflexively, placing the book aside. The movement is stiff, rehearsed. He's already learning that every motion from now on will be scrutinized, rehearsed, controlled. You glance down. The book, a Latin Bible. Of course. He's fluent. He's also 9. You sit across from him. Neither of you speaks for a while. But eventually he breaks the silence. They told me he died with honor. You don't correct him. He looks down at his hands, small and still pink with youth. The sleeves of his doublet swallow his wrists. He fiddles with a cufflink. And that I must be strong. Still, you say nothing. Because what is there to say? He has just inherited a throne from a man whose final years were filled with pain, paranoia, and political whiplash. A man who created a kingdom in his image and left it in chaos. A man who feared being forgotten so much that he built monuments out of marriages. And now, this boy sits in his place. You finally speak gently. Are you afraid? He doesn't answer. But you see it in his face. He is. Of course he is. Because being a child monarch in Tudor England is not a gift, it's a test, and the stakes are nothing less than your head. Let's step outside for a moment and look at the big picture. Henry VIII has left England in spiritual whiplash. 1 decade, it's Catholicism, then Protestantism, then back again. Now Edward is expected to carry on the Reformation, but no one quite agrees on how. The nobles around him are circling. His uncle Seymour wants power. Others, like John Dudley, are watching closely, waiting for a stumble. Mary, his half-sister, is quietly furious. And Elizabeth is watching everything with an expression that gives away nothing at all. And most dangerously of all, the people are confused. They don't know what to believe anymore. The Latin Mass is gone. The monasteries have vanished. Saints are out. Bibles are in. But only in certain parishes. Change came fast and messy under Henry, and now England is a ship with no wind and a child at the helm. Back in the room, Edward rises. He walks to the window, unlatches the shutter, and peers out into the half-lit courtyard. Below, stable boys are loading hay. A soldier stretches near the gate. Life is continuing as it always does. "Do you think he was a good king?" Edward asks. You pause. You could say yes, you could say no, but you choose honesty with a shrug. "He was a complicated king." Edward nods like that makes sense. Maybe it does. Maybe it always has. Here's a fringe fact that scholars love to debate. Did Henry VIII know he was dying for years? Some evidence suggests he began preparing Edward long before his final collapse, planting the idea that his son would complete the work he started: the Church of England, the fight against papal interference, the glorification of the crown overall. Others believe Henry didn't plan much of anything, that he was reactive, ruled by appetite and instinct, that Edward's training was accidental inheritance, not strategy, the truth. As always with Henry. The jury's still out. Edward turns back to you. They say he left instructions. He's talking about the will again. The infamous, unsigned, widely interpreted will. The one that names his Regency Council, distributes estates, and vaguely defines religious policy. You almost tell him not to worry. But you know better. Because those instructions are already being rewritten, reshaped by the council for their own ends. Edward may be king in name, but the grown men in doublets and ruffs will be the ones calling the shots until he's old enough to speak with the weight of authority. If he ever is. You leave the boy king in his chamber, watching the grey sky lighten over Windsor. As you close the door, you hear his voice behind you. "I hope I don't end up like him." You stop hand on the doorframe, but you don't turn back, because there's no comfort you can give that won't feel like a lie. You leave Edward to his thoughts and walk the winding halls of Windsor alone, the kind of alone that hums, the kind that's aware of every step, every echo, the kind that makes you feel like you're walking through a place that remembers more than it shows. You turn a corner and pause beneath a stained glass window casting dusty red light on the floor. There's a tapestry to your left, a familiar face, Anne Boleyn. No crown on her head in this one, just a white headdress, a square neckline, and dark, determined eyes, stitched in silk. She looks nothing like her portraits. This one was done before her fall, before the tower, before her head came off with a single French sword stroke. And now she's back woven into the stonework of a palace, where her husband now rests in pitch and linen. You wonder, did she win? It's a strange question. After all, she lost everything. Her title, her life, her dignity, in death. But through it all, she gave Henry the thing he wanted more than anything, except roast venison and ecclesiastical control, a son, or rather, a child who lived. Well, almost. Because her child wasn't Edward. It was Elizabeth. And she too still waits in the shadows. You trace your steps back through the royal gallery, your boots silent on the worn flags. Every wall holds echoes, tapestries of tournaments, portraits of stiff-backed kings and pale queens, grim-eyed saints looking down with expressions that say, "Good luck." This place is haunted, not by ghosts, by memory, by wives. Let's pause and remember them. Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess, married to Henry's brother first. Then Henry, loyal, devout, politically savvy, cast aside because she didn't produce a male heir, died in exile. Anne Boleyn, sharp, witty, ambitious, got what she wanted, until she didn't. Executed on accusations most historians now agree were completely invented. Jane Seymour, the quiet one, gave Henry his son and conveniently died before she could disappoint him, buried beside him. His true wife, according to Henry himself. Anne of Cleves, the diplomatic pawn, married and divorced in a matter of months. Henry said she looked like a horse. She walked away with a castle and her head intact. Probably the smartest of them all. Catherine Howard, young, flirtatious, maybe a little too naive, executed for adultery. Cried for her mother before the axe fell. Catherine Parr, the survivor, outlived Henry, nursed him through his final festering years. Widowed, remarried, died in childbirth soon after. Quietly brilliant. You pass a portrait of Henry now, that one. The big one, legs wide, hands on hips, codpiece prominent. Shoulders like an ox, eyes narrowed like he already suspects betrayal in your tone. You stare at it for a moment and then smile just slightly, because this too is myth, this too is packaging. The real Henry behind that pose, He was insecure, obsessed with legacy, terrified of being forgotten, convinced that a son was the only way to prove his divine favor, and utterly blind to the fact that the child who'd reshaped the world wasn't the boy he fought to produce, but the girl he barely acknowledged until his final years. Elizabeth. She's 13 now, watching, learning, navigating the corridors with a mind sharper than most men twice her age. No one sees her coming. Not yet, but she's already memorized every lie, every betrayal, every crack in the crown's gold veneer. You duck into the chapel one last time before leaving. It's empty now. The candles have burned low. The scent of wax clings to the pews. You walk quietly to Henry's tomb. Nothing has changed. The stone is cool, impassive, sealed, but it feels different, less threatening, less swollen with legacy. For a moment you imagine them all, his wives standing behind you in the shadows, watching, smirking, silent. They survived him in the ways that mattered. And now England belongs to the children, the boy he raised, the girl he ignored, the daughter he never really understood, and the legacy still leaking. Evening settles over the castle like a velvet curtain, and you find yourself standing outside in the courtyard staring up at the windows of Windsor. Behind each one, a story is shifting, a secret is traded, a plan is scribbled onto parchment in flickering candlelight, and somewhere behind one of those glowing panes sits a name whispered, but not yet feared aloud, Anne Boleyn, or rather her echo, because tonight you're going to hear the ghost story. You follow a narrow servants' corridor, torch in hand, until you reach a part of the castle most avoid after sunset. The stone is darker here, damper. Even the rats you sense tread lightly. You pass a crooked door with a rusted iron ring and descend a curling stairwell lower than the chapel, deeper than the kitchens. And there, by the flicker of your torch, you find it an old chamber where servants and guards sometimes gather after hours. And as you arrive, someone is already in the middle of telling the tale. "She came in the night," says the man, his voice hushed, headless, silent, barefoot, dressed in white. The others lean in, eyes dart. No one breathes. They say she walks the halls on the anniversary of her death, that her eyes glow where her face used to be, that her feet make no sound but her gown drips with blood anyway. The room shivers, and you can't help yourself. You ask casually, "Who is she?" The man doesn't even blink. "Anne Boleyn, the queen he beheaded." You nod slowly. Because of course it is. The story has taken root. In taverns, in kitchens, in low whispers passed between stable boys. Anne Boleyn returned from the grave, her ghostly presence, a silent judgment on the man who once promised her the world and delivered only a scaffold. You've seen her portrait, the delicate features, the dark eyes, the slight smirk that speaks volumes. And now in the dark underbelly of Windsor, you hear the other version of her legacy, the Revenant Queen. Some say she walks the halls not to haunt Henry, but to watch over her daughter Elizabeth. Others claim she appears only when the realm is in danger, that she's not malevolent, just unfinished. Scholars, of course, remain divided. Many dismiss the tales as superstition, products of Tudor guilt, a way for the mind to resolve the horror of what Henry did by believing Anne still lingers seeking closure or justice, or simply to be seen again. But the common folk, they believe. They say she's been seen gliding across the floor of Hampton Court, pausing before the doors of the room where she was arrested. Others claim she's appeared in the Tower of London, standing beneath the arch where the axe fell. Some even say she smiled before vanishing. And here tonight, someone swears she passed through this very corridor just last year. No face, says a kitchen maid, just a shape. But she looked like she remembered everything. You sit for a moment and let the tale settle in your chest. Because in a strange way, Anne did survive Henry. Not in body, but in name, in shadow, in the sharp red-haired daughter now rising through court with steady grace and steel beneath her skirts. Henry may have tried to erase her legacy, but Elizabeth will resurrect it. The room falls silent as the tale ends. Someone crosses themselves. Someone else pours a little wine on the ground, an old offering, just in case. You climb the stairs again slowly, your torch sputtering in the damp, and when you reach the upper hall, something makes you pause, just for a second. The corridor is empty, but the candle at the far end flickers. The air turns just a bit colder, and you feel no sense that you're not alone. No sound, no presence, just a weight in the air, a memory too proud to die quietly. You whisper into the stillness, "I see you," and whether it's imagination wind or something older than grief, you swear the flame bows in reply. Anne never wanted to be a ghost, but perhaps she decided being one was the only way to be remembered properly. The next morning arrives heavy and overcast, as if the sky itself hasn't quite shaken off the memory of Henry's final journey. You step into the Great Hall of Windsor, expecting silence but find noise. Controlled respectable, but unmistakably festive. They're feasting. Yes, already. A banquet is being prepared in the king's honor, or rather, in honor of the idea of the king. You watch as servants lay out trenchers, roasted game wine in pewter jugs, gilded plates that sparkle under the high windows. A boar's head sits at the center of one long table, its mouth stuffed with oranges. Steam curls up from platters of sugared swans and veal pies the size of milk pails. This isn't a funeral meal. It's a show. And it's not for Henry. It's for the court. Because the kingdom still runs on image, appearances, ceremony, and nothing projects stability like a full stomach and well-timed fanfare. Today's event is a mix of mourning and political theatre, and you can almost hear the unspoken words beneath every spoken toast. Nothing to worry about. The boy king is strong, the realm is united, but you were there. You know how many pieces are glued together behind this feast. You slip around the edges of the hall watching the guests arrive. There's Seymour standing taller than usual. He's already beginning to test the tone of Lord Protector in his voice. There's Bishop Cranmer, eyes wary, hands folded too carefully. There's John Dudley smiling with all teeth and no warmth. And sitting near the end of the table, not yet quite part of the main crowd, is Elizabeth. She's dressed in deep green, her red hair braided tightly down her back. She's only 13, but she looks older today, sharper. She watches the adults as if they're a chessboard. Each motion noted, each expression weighed. You nod to her. She doesn't smile. She sees everything. And then the banquet begins. The master of the revels announces the course. The minstrels play softly near the hearth. A priest gives a brief, tastefully vague blessing. Then the first plates arrive. Mutton figs, honeyed carrots, hard cheese in soft bread crusts. You sit at the far end, out of the splash zone of political performance. Let's talk for a moment about the strangeness of royal feasts in times of death. This is not unique to Henry. Medieval and Tudor courts often held lavish meals after a king died. Why? Because mourning too much could signal instability. The quicker you move to show normalcy, the less likely you were to spark rebellion. But this one feels especially grotesque. You know what happened. You saw the dripping coffin, the bursting ulcer, the pitch and wax and vinegar. And now you're watching men devour roast pheasant while toasting the immortal legacy of England's greatest king. One noble raises a goblet and says with syrupy pomp, "To Henry, who conquered not just lands but the hearts of his people, you nearly choke on your spiced wine." Another adds, "Who left this realm richer, more righteous and resolute." You stare at the tapestry behind him, a map of England, and wonder how many abbeys burned to pay for this party. Someone clinks their spoon against a cup. The laughter grows louder, but not everyone is playing along. Elizabeth remains still. She picks at her food politely, but her eyes remain locked on the main table. On Edward, sitting stiffly between two bishops, nodding whenever someone leans over to whisper praise. He's not eating. He's watching too. Across the hall, a group of foreign envoys sits slightly removed, speaking in hushed French and Latin. One of them raises an eyebrow at the spectacle. You catch the word decadent. You think of the monks at Sion Abbey still scrubbing the altar floor, of the servants who had to lift the body, of the groom of the stool probably somewhere outside, breathing deep through a lavender sachet and trying to forget the last 3 days. And then there's a moment. The hall grows quiet. A herald steps forward with a poem, an original composition about Henry's reign. It begins noble as you'd expect. Strong was the hand that guided this land, mighty the heart that shattered Rome's hold, fearless the blade that made England free. And then, as the herald reaches the final verse, he stumbles. His voice wavers. He says, "And when the day came that God did call, our sovereign lay peaceful, mourned by all. You hear a cough from somewhere near the fire. You hear a snort, unmistakably a servant failing to suppress it. And then a clatter, as someone drops a spoon and mutters, Peaceful, my arse. A few heads turn. One man chuckles under his breath. It's fragile. The myth. Already cracking. Already being whispered against. Because no amount of sugar-dusted lamb or parchment poetry can undo what was seen. You excuse yourself from the hall and step outside. The cold air hits like a balm. You breathe deep and let the noise of the feast fade behind the stone. Let them toast. Let them lie. You were there, and you remember. You leave the echoes of toasts and the clatter of cutlery behind as you wander into the royal gardens where the air is blessedly quiet and mercifully free of roast meat and revisionist history. The hedges are still trimmed, the gravel paths still swept as if death hadn't slipped past the guards just a few nights ago and left the most powerful man in England dripping through his coffin. And yet his mark is everywhere. You pass a marble bench with a Tudor rose carved into its side. A sundial shaped like a lion's paw. A fountain at the far end of the garden with an inscription in Latin that roughly translates to, "I am the light of England." You half expect the water to start seeping pitch. You sit for a moment beneath a bare-limbed yew and let your thoughts drift to one of Henry's most lasting legacies, the faith that no one really asked for. Because while everyone inside is debating politics and power outside in the parishes and towns across the kingdom, people are still confused about what they're supposed to believe. Was England Catholic, Protestant? Both, neither. Let's rewind just a bit. Before Henry, England was Catholic, full stop. Pope in Rome monasteries humming with prayer and land holdings, saints in every stained glass window. Then came Henry's great matter, his obsession with divorcing Catherine of Aragon. When Rome said no, Henry created his own church, naming himself supreme head and kicking off a religious identity crisis that would stretch across generations. Monasteries were closed. Their gold melted down their monks, evicted or worse. Priests began using English instead of Latin. New prayer books appeared. Some churches burned their saints. Others quietly hid them. But, and here's the twist, Henry never stopped being Catholicish in his own private way. He still believed in the sacraments. He still had Mass. He still wore holy relics on his belt like charms. He just didn't want the Pope to tell him what to do. So what does that leave behind religious whiplash? You stroll past a knot garden each hedge like a tightly wound question. Because that's what the English people are living with now, tight, knotted, contradictory beliefs wrapped in royal seals. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Henry's reforms laid the foundation for Protestant England, but it was his children who turned it into a battleground. Edward VI, raised by Protestants, more zealous than his father ever was. Under his rule, stained glass was smashed, altars stripped, and churches stripped of Latin. Mary A, staunch Catholic. When she took the throne, she reversed everything, restoring papal supremacy and burning Protestants at the stake. And then, Elizabeth Protestant again, but with style. She found a middle way, a Church of England that pretended everything made sense. But back here in Henry's garden, just days after his burial, none of that has happened yet. The future is still unwritten, and the people, they're waiting, holding their breath, whispering in pews, hiding rosaries in flour sacks, looking to the boy king and wondering if he'll let the churches burn brighter or go dark. The truth is, Henry didn't give them clarity. He gave them chaos, wrapped in confidence. And you wonder, was that the plan? Some scholars say no, Henry was a reactive ruler, constantly shifting to suit his appetite, his pride, his next wife. Others believe he did have a vision, a strong monarchy, a national church, a realm untethered from foreign control. But the method, like everything, with Henry clumsy, bloody, inconsistent. The jury's still out. You pass a low stone wall and pause, resting your hand on the cold ledge. The garden's still. The kind of stillness that comes after a storm. But you know the wind will pick up again soon. Inside the castle, debates are sharpening. Out here, you can almost hear England murmuring, "What do we worship now? Which hymns are allowed? Can we light candles to saints? Do we say Paternoster in Latin or English? And most importantly, who's next?" Because if Edward dies and Mary rises, everything could change again. And if Elizabeth comes after, well, let's just say the church might need a few more coats of paint. You pick up a fallen sprig of rosemary from the path. It's brittle, already drying. You twirl it in your fingers and remember when they packed it around the king's coffin. They said it was for remembrance. You wonder if anyone remembers what they were praying for 10 years ago. You wonder if anyone dares to say what they believe now. You drop the rosemary back into the garden and walk on. The sun is setting. And England. It's still trying to find the right words for God, written in the blood of a king who couldn't spell consistency if it was carved into his wine goblet. The castle grows quieter now, its many voices folding into murmurs, its windows dimmed one by one as dusk takes over. You return to the private wing of the palace, where courtiers seldom linger, where silence lingers, instead thick as dust, and where for just a moment you can look past the rot and rituals and examine what's actually left behind. Not the body, not the scandal, not even the legend, but the institutions. Because if there's one thing Henry VIII left England, besides a mess of religious arguments and a warehouse of elaborate codpieces, it's the foundation of modern monarchy. Let's take a slow walk through the consequences. First stop, the Church of England. Created out of convenience. Sure, but it stuck. Henry broke from Rome not because he had a grand theological plan, but because he wanted an annulment. Yet in doing so, he made England sovereign not just in politics, but in soul. Kings would no longer answer to popes. Royal blood now came with spiritual supremacy baked in. That's not just ego. That's architecture. Henry rewrote what it meant to rule. You pass a vaulted hallway lined with scrollwork ledgers, treaties bills, signed in ornate script. This is where Henry's bureaucratic brilliance begins to emerge from the shadow of his appetites. He wasn't just a tyrant. He was an organizer. Under his rule, the Royal Council was reshaped into something sharper. The Privy Council, a smaller, more controlled group of advisors, began to form. He consolidated financial systems, streamlined crown lands, established the Court of Augmentations to gobble up former monastery wealth and redirect it to the crown. Henry turned royal governance into a machine. Next up, royal propaganda. Oh yes. Long before Instagram and image consultants, Henry understood branding. You pass another portrait of him in the corridor, broad-legged, one hand on a dagger, the other on a glove, staring down with eyes that seemed to dare you to speak out of turn. He had artists reshape him literally. A widening waistline cropped out. Fading hairline fixed. He posed like a war god, long after he could lift a sword. Even when his body broke, the image held firm. And that image, it mattered. It told his subjects who they were dealing with. It told foreign kings to tread carefully. It told his enemies that even when his legs were bursting open from infection, he was still king. You slip through a side door into a quieter chamber. A small fire burns low, and across the room hangs something curious, a tapestry of Henry's succession line. It's inaccurate, of course, hastily updated. Mary and Elizabeth have been stitched into place like afterthoughts. But even here his obsession shows. He wanted to control everything, not just power, not just policy, but the very story of his life and afterlife. And yet, despite all the control, all the councils, proclamations, and self-authored grandeur, there's something fragile about what remains. Because here's your quirky, footnote-level fact of the day. In the immediate years after Henry's death, many of the institutions he strengthened began to fracture. The Privy Council mired in power struggles. The Church of England pulled violently back and forth by his children. Even his treasury began to leak like his coffin. Some scholars argue Henry's legacy was more blueprint than building. He drew the outlines, set the tone, but it was his successors who would fill in the walls. Sometimes wisely, sometimes with fire. The jury's still out. You move toward a long, narrow window that overlooks the outer bailey. Far below, a courier rides out on horseback, kicking up a storm of dust, likely delivering yet another royal directive, a plan, an edit, a correction to the history already being rewritten. Because that's the thing. Henry VIII left behind mechanisms, systems, palaces, processes. But the thing he wanted to leave, most of all, an unchallenged legacy that's still wobbling, still leaking, still being patched together by advisors who smile too easily and pray too loudly. You stare at the fire a moment longer. One log collapses, sparks pop quietly, and you wonder if that's what legacies really are, carefully stacked kindling, waiting for someone, maybe a daughter, maybe a scribe, to light them correctly, or just let them burn. You return to the long gallery just before midnight, where the moonlight throws soft silver across the polished floorboards, and the silence hums with the tension of unsaid things. The castle, for all its grandeur, has finally stilled. No more nobles clinking goblets, no more scribes rustling parchment, no muffled whispers of what now just stillness. You pause beneath a portrait. Another one. Henry again. In this one, he's younger, barely past his coronation. Clean-shaven, almost boyish. His eyes are still bright, not yet dulled by betrayal or ulcers or gout. There's hope in this version of him. Optimism. Possibility. It's strange, because the man in that portrait barely resembles the one who spent his final hours leaking through his sheets while frightened nobles argued about who'd get blamed for blinking first. But that's the trick, isn't it? Henry left behind dozens of portraits, each more heroic than the last. In oil and gold leaf, he's always commanding, always confident. But the truth is more complicated. The man who created an entire religion just to bend the world to his desires, who dissolved hundreds of monasteries for coin and power, who believed in fate when it suited him, and beheadings when it didn't. He was also deeply insecure. You remember a passage you once heard from a courtier's private letter. He wrote that His Majesty would not sleep in rooms with uneven walls, nor dine with plates too near in colour to silver, lest he think himself less a king, a man who needed constant reassurance that he was not just powerful but righteous. You walk further down the gallery. The torches are out now, just low sconces glowing in corners. And you pass artifacts, things Henry touched, commissioned, obsessed over. A jewelled chalice, a sword inscribed with Latin, a book of hours with a tiny image of Christ that looks oddly like Henry himself. Subtle branding. He wasn't just a king, he was his own fan club, and that obsessive self-image, it bled into policy. Let's talk propaganda. This wasn't an era of newspapers or social media, but Henry's court still managed to control the narrative. Painters, poets, chroniclers, many of them were paid or threatened into shaping the public view. Dissenting voices, silenced. Monks who grumbled, disrobed, or disappeared. One historian put it best. Henry ruled with a pen in one hand and a headsman's axe in the other, and the axe, as we know, saw plenty of use. You pause at a display case. Inside, an ornate quill lies on crushed velvet. Legend says it was one of Henry's favourites, carved from a goose feather, trimmed with gold wire. Whether or not he used it to sign actual documents is questionable, but that's not the point. It's here now under glass, preserved like a holy relic. And you ask yourself why? Why? Preserve the pen of a man who tore down abbeys, rewrote marriage law for convenience, and swung the state from Catholic to Protestant, and back again like a tavern sign in a storm, because Henry knew that symbols outlast facts. And the Tudor dynasty learned that well. Look at Elizabeth, still just a girl now, but one day she'll take that lesson and run with it. She'll wrap herself in symbols. The Virgin Queen, Gloriana, Astrea reborn. She'll be more icon than woman. And it all starts here in these halls beneath the portraits of a man who posed like a god and prayed like a sinner. You exit the gallery and step into the open air. The wind has changed. Colder now. Crisper. You breathe it in and feel it cut through your sleeves. Far off a bell tolls once. Midnight. You turn to look back at the castle. So many towers. So many secrets. So much crafted memory. And in the quiet, you wonder how much of Henry remains in today's monarchy. In the idea of royalty itself, the absolute certainty, the branding, the carefully stage-managed legacy. He wasn't the first monarch to care about how he'd be remembered, but he was one of the first to realize he could control it, even from the grave. Dawn breaks slowly over Windsor, casting long shafts of light across the mist-laced grounds. You wake early, earlier than usual. Maybe it's the air, or maybe it's the feeling that something is shifting beneath the polished veneer of royal routine. The king is still dead, but already the future is sharpening its claws. You step into a small council chamber, quiet but for the scratching of quills. Men sit at a long table with maps, letters, and lists, spread like a feast of strategy. Their voices are low, precise. Every word carries weight. This is where succession stops being ceremonial and starts becoming dangerous. Lord Seymour Edward's uncle sits at the head. His eyes are red-rimmed but alert, already scanning the names of allies, debts, and potential traitors. Next to him, Dudley reviews a list of bishops loyal to the crown. Someone else mutters about the navy. Another is drawing up plans to house Princess Elizabeth more securely. It's not paranoia. It's prevention. Because Tudor England doesn't rest on peace. It rests on a balance of grudges, families and shifting loyalties held together by hastily waxed seals and prayer books. You inch closer to the table. One document catches your eye, Henry's last will and testament, or rather what's being presented as such. It's a copy, a clean one. The ink isn't smudged, the signature suspiciously tidy. There's a note in the margin to be affirmed by council as valid. You don't need a historian to tell you what's happening here. They're backdating decisions. They're correcting inconvenient truths. They're finishing sentences that Henry never wrote, so that they can rule in his name without having to follow his ghost too closely. Because the real danger now isn't that Henry is gone. It's that his wishes were always a bit vague. Take, for instance, the Regency Council. Henry wanted Edward to have 16 advisors. Equal power. Balance. Checks. But already Seymour is manoeuvring. One voice will be louder than the others. His. And here's the thing that wasn't Henry's intent, or maybe it was. Scholars still debate whether Henry was cunning enough to plant chaos so he'd be needed even after death, or whether he just got tired and didn't finish the document properly. The truth, as usual, with Henry, it's muddy, and the mud is political gold, because when a royal will is unclear, it becomes a canvas. And everyone around this table is already sketching their version of the future onto it. You glance to the edge of the room where a stack of blank parchment waits. A new reign is beginning, and they're writing it already. Not in poetry or prayer, but in orders, decrees, marriages arranged, land redistributed, loyalty rewarded, silence purchased. It's all happening now before the ink on the tombstone has metaphorically dried. And who's at the centre of all this? Edward VI, age 9, sitting in a separate room with a tutor, probably copying Latin verb conjugations while grown men reshape the kingdom in his name. You step back and exit quietly, heading toward the solar, where Elizabeth often spends her mornings. And sure enough, she's there, alone by the window, a book open in her lap. She looks up. Her gaze is steady. They're planning, she says before you can even greet her. You nod. They've always been planning, she adds. You sit beside her. She closes the book but keeps one finger in the page, as if reminding you, I was reading before you arrived. I'll return to it when you're gone. Did he love me? She asks suddenly. You hesitate, because it's not a simple answer. Did Henry VIII love his daughter Elizabeth sometimes? When it was convenient, when she was quiet, when she looked like Anne, but not too much like Anne, when she impressed visiting envoys with her clever tongue, when she didn't remind him of the wife he'd executed. Love in Henry's world was conditional, transactional. He loved what reflected well on him, but you give her the answer she already suspects. He respected you. She nods again, as if that's both disappointing and empowering. Good, she says. I don't need more than that. That's when you see it. The flicker of ambition, not greed, not hunger, but the clear-eyed understanding that she's in the middle of something shifting, that the rules are being bent, and that one day, if she's careful, she can be the one bending them. This is not a child lost in mourning. This is the making of a monarch. Henry's death didn't just spark a scramble for power. It opened the gates for futures. No one dared speak aloud. Elizabeth knows it. So does Mary in her own cold, defiant way. And somewhere in a vault beneath the chapel, Henry lies beneath stone and wax and centuries of contradiction. Still leaking, still shaping the world. Even now, late afternoon drapes the palace in that peculiar hush that settles after too many decisions have been made too quickly. You walk the outer cloisters of Windsor, your boots echoing on the stone, your breath misting in the cool air. The castle feels heavier now, not just with grief, but with the weight of expectation. You stop beneath a statue of St. George, the patron of England, poised mid-slash atop a weathered dragon. And for a moment you wonder who the dragon really is. Spain, Rome, heresy. The ghost of Henry VIII, leaking political gas into every chamber. You keep walking, because while the palace scurries to prepare a child to rule the people beyond these walls, are living the consequences of Henry's reign. In towns and parishes and smoky taverns, the shock is still settling. News spreads slower than you'd think, but word always finds a way, and with it questions. You pause at the gatehouse. A courier returns, mud-streaked, breathless. He's delivering something. A letter from Norfolk, perhaps, or a report from the Midlands. A noble's concern, a bishop's warning. You don't ask. You already know everyone's trying to decide how loud to whisper now. Because while Henry's death has been officially announced, his power still lingers. Not in law, not in body, but in fear. Deep generational fear. The kind bred when a king could love you on Monday and burn you by Friday. Let's talk about the nightmares he left behind. Daily life under Henry was not pageantry and lute songs. It was paranoia. It was uncertainty. It was rules that changed depending on who he'd married that week. You step into the lower courtyard where stable boys and scullery maids huddle over bowls of pottage trading, rumours the way nobles trade titles. You overhear one boy say, "My uncle wouldn't eat meat on Friday," said it was still sin. His friend scoffs. "But didn't the king say saints were frauds now?" A third shrugs. "Depends which week you ask him." There it is. That's the chaos Henry left behind. Spiritual whiplash. 1 year pilgrimages are holy. The next, they're sedition. Confession to a priest vital, then criminal. Light a candle in church, might get you blessed or fined. Even the calendar was unsure. Feast days erased. Saints defrocked. The old world gutted like a fish and left dangling in the sun, while the new one stuttered and tripped over Latin prayers halfway translated into English. And it wasn't just religion. The law was just as slippery. Nobles could be executed for intent. Subjects arrested for rumours. Parliament wasn't a debating chamber, it was a rubber stamp, gilded and sharpened. Even Henry's closest friends, more Cromwell, ended up on the block when they served too well, or not well enough. You glance at a stone drain in the corner of the courtyard. Once that same drain ran red with the blood of cooks, jesters, clerks, anyone who spoke too freely in the wrong earshot. You wonder how many of their ghosts still haunt these stones. If they sit quietly beside Anne Boleyn's, or whisper to the wind every time a king forgets he was once human. Back in the hallways, the courtiers are laughing again, loudly, almost too loudly. Jokes are floating again over wine. It's that peculiar kind of relief that comes when danger passes, when the tyrant is buried and his shoes are far too large for his heir to fill. And yet, they still look over their shoulders, still speak Henry's name carefully, because no one quite believes he's really gone. Here's your fringe historical tidbit for today. Long after Henry's death, people still feared quoting him in public. Some even left his name out of letters. Not out of reverence, out of habit. Because when you spend 3 decades tiptoeing through royal moods, that dance doesn't end with the burial. One noble famous for his silence was once asked why he never spoke of Henry. He replied, "Because I still hear his footsteps when I dream." You understand now. Henry wasn't just a man. He was an atmosphere, a climate, a gravitational force that pulled everyone in and crushed those who didn't bend just enough. And when he died, he didn't vanish. He settled like dust into every corner of the kingdom. You walk through the cloister again, listening to your own footfalls. You pause beneath a window that overlooks the chapel where he lies sealed in stone beside Jane. You whisper, "Do they dream of you, Henry?" And just for a moment it feels like the answer is yes. You awaken to rain, not a storm, just a soft, steady curtain of water washing over the grey stone walls of Windsor, as if the sky itself decided it was time to help clean up the mess. The castle looks different when wet. The flags hang heavy. The carved faces above the arches look mournful. The courtyards are slick with mud and silence. You make your way toward the royal crypt one last time. The guards nod but don't speak. The priests lower their heads as you pass. No one wants to be in this part of the castle anymore. The worst is supposed to be over. And yet, there's a sense that something still lingers down here. You descend the steps slowly. The air grows colder, mustier, more final. At the bottom, tucked into the stone, lies Henry, or what's left of him. The coffin hasn't moved. The tomb remains unmarked, just stone above, stone below. Jane Seymour rests beside him, her presence there a mixture of romance and regret. He always called her his true wife, mostly because she died before he had the chance to resent her. You approach the tomb, and for a moment you just stare. What is there to say? You've walked through his story. You've seen the ulcers, smelled the linens, heard the fear in every servant's breath. You've watched a court pretend he wasn't dying and a kingdom pretend he died well. And now you see what remains. Not the grandeur, not the law books, not the painted myths. Just a slab of limestone in a crypt that smells of wax and damp memory. Let's take a breath here. You've earned one. Because we've told a lot of stories up until now. About wives and war and wax and wine. About gout and ghosts and legal forgeries. About Henry the husband, Henry the butcher, Henry the builder. But this moment here in the crypt, it's about Henry the human. Because under all the gold and grime, he was still just that. A boy raised to be king. A man desperate to matter. A person terrified of being forgotten. A body that, like everybody, failed him in the end. And here's a fact most people forget: Henry never wanted to be buried here. He wanted a great tomb, a towering monument, a golden effigy flanked by angels and Latin praise. He hired artists, paid sculptors, designed it himself. It was never built. The work stopped after his death. Funding vanished. Politics shifted. And so he was lowered into this interim vault with Jane, and there he remains 5 centuries later, unfinished. Some say it's fitting. Others call it a tragedy. You just see it for what it is, the one thing he couldn't control. Because no matter how many wives he discarded or monasteries he dissolved, Henry VIII couldn't outlive time. And time in the end doesn't care about codpieces or coronation scrolls. Time levels all things, even kings. You stand quietly. No jokes now. No footnotes. Just you and a man who once ruled your world lying silent beneath your feet. And yet, even as he rests, you know the mess he made is still being sorted. His son is too young. His daughters are too different. His kingdom is too divided. And his memory already being edited by those who need it to look neater. But that's not the version you've carried. You remember the swelling, the groaning cart, the oily seepage through the coffin seams, the servants holding their breath, the silence that followed. You remember the truth, and for that, maybe it's worth whispering just once before you leave. You mattered, but not how you thought you would. You lay one hand on the cold stone. Then you climb back into the world. You're back where you started now, beneath the high arches of Windsor, where the tapestries sway faintly, and the courtiers walk with just a little more certainty. The king is dead. Long live the boy. The feast has ended. The embalmers have gone home. And the history books are already being polished. But you haven't forgotten. And as you move through the corridors one last time, you can't help but trace your fingers along the spine of this whole ordeal. The strange, sad, grotesque unravelling of one of England's most powerful kings. You've seen what the history books skip. You've walked in the rot. You've breathed in the wax and wine and fear, and now it's time to leave it behind. Almost. Because there's one final twist. As you pass the Royal Library, quiet, orderly, the smell of parchment and aging leather, you catch sight of a clerk shelving a small stack of books. One slips loose and thuds gently onto the floor. You stoop to pick it up. The title, The Glorious Reign of Henry VIII, Defender of the Faith, Father of England. You blink. Inside the chapters paint a portrait of a wise and just ruler. It mentions nothing of pus ulcers or exploding leg wounds. Anne Boleyn is described as a political misstep. The break from Rome is a necessary adjustment. The wives briefly listed. The death dignified, devout, and attended by his closest men. You almost laugh. Almost. But you don't. Because this book, this is what will survive. This is what school children will read. What foreign ambassadors will quote. What future kings will study when deciding how much truth to allow into their own legacy. You slide the book back onto the shelf and walk out without a word. And as the door closes behind you, you reflect not on Henry's body, not the one packed with spices and pitch, but on his idea. The myth that outlived the man. He wanted glory. He got noise. He wanted eternal power. He got contradiction. He wanted a son who would rule forever. He got a sick child, a burned queen, and a daughter who would wear his crown better than he ever did. He wanted control. But in the end, his corpse leaked through the floorboards. His will was edited by panicked nobles, and his greatest achievement was surviving himself long enough to die in his own bed. Not many in Tudor England could say that. And yet even now his fingerprints are everywhere, in the way monarchs rule, in the idea that image is everything, in the shifting line between divine right and careful branding. You stand once more in the courtyard and look up at the Union Jack, flapping gently on the tower. The storm has passed. The rain is gone. A few servants sweep the steps. The world has moved on. But you haven't. Not quite. You'll carry this story. You'll remember the leaks, the silences, the trembling hands around his deathbed. And when someone quotes the books, you'll know what they left out. Henry VIII didn't just die strangely. He died exactly as he lived, messy, complicated, loud, and impossible to ignore. So now, as we pull back from Windsor's high walls, let your mind drift. The torches are out, the banquet has cooled, the nobles have folded their ambitions into quiet letters, and beneath the chapel floor the echoes of a king still hum through the stone. Let them fade. Let the noise of power give way to something softer. Breathe. Feel the tension unwind from your shoulders. No more horses pulling dripping wagons. No more whispered plots behind velvet curtains. No more linens soaked in pitch or prayers mumbled through pinched noses. Just silence. And in that silence the truth history is rarely neat, rarely noble, often human, often flawed. You've walked through shadows tonight, not just of Henry, but of all the people who orbited him, who bent to his whims, who were broken by his moods. And somehow you've made it through. So now, dim the lights. Let the candles flicker low, pull the blanket a little tighter, and let yourself settle. You're safe now. The past is behind you. The coffin is sealed. The story is complete. End of script. Sweet dreams.